Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I know some of you may have struggled through the Washington, D.C. public transport system, and some of you have come further and gone through a lot more than that. I'm Barbara Miller, a cultural anthropologist and director of the Global Gender Program, which is within the Elliott School of International Affairs here at GW. Much of what we do, I think, as faculty and researchers is often to critique what's going wrong in the world, what's not working in international development and gender inequality. That's important work. It has to be done. But happily, we can also study, document, and celebrate what works. 4 or 5 years ago, we organized a conference on what works in development, and it was hard because we're mostly trained to talk about what doesn't work. So we have to keep changing our minds around. So when I learned about the work of Marlene Stearns, who you're going to meet in a few minutes, I just thought, these are cases of what works. We need them, and we need more. And then we decided to bring the actual women cases to Washington, D.C. to speak and to meet you all. Awesome. I think we're kind of also we're pretty cool here in the Elliott School. We have panels that include academics and professionals, but not usually, I hate to say real people. I mean, because we're all kind of real. And I don't want to call you cases, because you're kind of more than that, but it's just a wonderful combination. So over the next 2 days, we have a unique opportunity to learn about what works in improving the quality of our food and coffee. I know some of you might say coffee's not a food, but I think a lot of people in Washington, D.C. think it's within the food pyramid and a pretty important part of it. I have so many people to thank for this conference. An anonymous donor for funding it, we love him. The Elliott School for support, for having this room that we can use. My staff, who are wonderful in IGES. And Marlene Stearns, the heart and brains behind recognizing the niche of women agribusiness leaders in the Global South. Marlene, please rise and take a bow. She is awesome. I had the privilege of getting to know her when she was here at GW getting an MIPP degree, a mid-career degree, Master's in International Policy and Practice. And we've been in touch ever since. I continue to watch her rising star. Marlene's Fulbright research, I believe, funded research around the world, mostly Africa and Latin America, which led to the cases of the 10 women agribusiness leaders that you're going to meet today. I would like, and they're all scattered around the audience. Apparently they didn't want to sit in the front row like I wanted them to do. I would like all of our 10 women agribusiness leaders to come forward, stand in front of this table with Marlene and with our keynote speaker for a group shot. Please come forward.
Well, don't be shy.
Sharon, Susanna, Yvette, Rhonda, Lisa, Monica, everybody. Where's Christina?
I am guilty of that. You want the center?
Yes, please.
Yeah, but I'm taller than you guys.
But that's okay, you can do the center.
Oh, yeah, but I don't want to block anyone.
No, there, in the center.
Okay, then, okay.
Come.
Okay, can we get a few more on this side, or can everybody scoot this way just a little bit? Okay, this side. There we go. Perfect. Can you back up just a little bit so we can get everybody on the same plane here? There we go. That is almost. Right. Oops. There we go. Man, can I get you to duck down? There we go. Much better.
He's pushing.
And one more. And one more. Thank you all very much.
In addition to bringing these 10 remarkable women here, Marlene has done a mountain of work to bring together an impressive set of speakers. the other kind of speakers, academics and professionals. It's just a star-studded 2 days, and I can't believe how much work she put into it and how effective she was, and how she got friends, volunteer friends. One of them's a diplomat. She calls him a dip, who put together this beautiful program. And every time she says, I've got to talk to the dip, I thought, you know what that means in American slang? Yeah, okay. Nothing more from me here. I'm going to turn the podium over to Marlene, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker, and away we go.
Thank you, Barbara. And I would like to invite everyone to give a round of applause to Barbara. This started with her vision and her encouragement and her support, and there's no greater champion for women in the world than Barbara Miller. That being said, due to changing climate, pollution of water sources from agrochemical runoff, degradation of soils and nutrients, due to overuse of erosion, deforestation, and use of farm strategies more focused on increasing yields than on improving food quality and diet diversity in the world, more farmers are returning to sustainable farm strategies to grow our food. All over the world, we are seeing women at the head of this movement. It's evident that many women, especially those you're going to meet in the next 2 days, were motivated to return to the land to fix these problems, to improve the safety and nutritional value of the foods grown for their families and their communities, and to take stewardship of the land back into their own hands. We call these women food leaders, and they're found up and down the agricultural and food supply chains. And nobody understands the impact of these women food leaders more than our opening keynote speaker. She is George Washington University's Executive Director of Sustainability, where she leads the GW Sustainability Collaborative, the GW Food Institute, and teaches courses on public policy. We're very lucky that she found time to join us this morning. She is co-chair of AGRI, the board director of Stonebard Center for the Food and Agricultural and Food Corps, and a steering committee member of the Council of Environmental Deans and Directors of the National Council for Science and Environment. She's the former Deputy Secretary and Chief Operating Officer of the United States Department of Agriculture, our Ministry of Agriculture, where she launched the Know Your Food, Know Your Farmer initiative in the United States, supporting local and regional food systems, connecting farmers and consumers. She's reached out to women farmers through innovative young farmer initiatives across the country, and she was an architect of our First Lady Michelle Obama's Let's Move campaign. And she was the first woman to chair the Ministerial Conference of the Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, of the United Nations. And her list of achievements doesn't stop there. She wrote the United States law establishing national standards for organic food. In 2010, Time magazine named her one of the most 100 influential people in the world. In the world. She is self-described as obsessed by women's and girls' education and empowerment throughout the world, especially in improving food and agricultural systems. And there is no doubt that she, too, is one of the female farmers' greatest champions. She's maturing the conversation on the future of food from a focus on production and increased yields to one that's inclusive of women, that focuses on producing quality and nutritious foods and preserve soil, quality, and environmental resources. So to invite her to continue this conversation this morning, please welcome Dr. Kathleen Merrigan.
Well, that was quite an introduction. I hope I can live up to it. I remember when I told my mother that I had been nominated to be the Deputy Secretary of Agriculture, and her response was, "Honey, that's so nice, but what do you know about farming?" So somehow this list of credentials keeps getting longer, and I keep becoming, anxious that someday someone's going to call me out as a big fraud. There are a lot of experts here in the room, and I don't want to pretend to be one, particularly as it relates to the Global South. So I thought this morning to kick off 2 days of what looks like an intensive, very substantive and exciting agenda, that I would start with some old war stories. Why? I like stories. I've been through a few wars, and ladies, I'm feeling old. So I got home on a train very late last night from New York City, and I'm not sure this tea is fully kicked in. So I want to start with a story of when I was younger, and I had just married my husband, and we both had conferences in St. Louis, and he's a civil rights lawyer. He works at the law school here at GW. And at the time, I don't remember what I was doing something. I was doing an NGO. I was very focused on ag research. And I went to this agricultural research meeting, and he went to a meeting of his world. And he came over to dinner at my hotel one night. You know, we're married. We might as well see each other every once in a while. And we went to the function. And we were going up the escalator. I'll never forget this moment. He said to me, I have never in my career been to a function like that. It was like kind of my daily bread. I just didn't quite get it. It was the typical rubber chicken, you know, the long speeches, someone who's imbibed too much wine. I'm like, oh, what do you mean you've never been to a meeting like that? I've never been to a meeting that was 98% white men over the age of 50. And what really struck me is that I had become immune to it. When I was younger, I was confused by it. I was frustrated by it. I was a woman involved in agriculture when the main organization here in the United States around women was called Women Involved with Farm Economics. If you reduce it down to acronyms, as we like to do in Washington, D.C., that is WIFE. So I had become immune to it. My husband had to point it out. And the next night I went to his dinner, and it was a totally different scene, incredibly diverse in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of socioeconomic status. We were living in two different worlds. So that's my opening story. It was about sort of my awakening to the need to be more outspoken about women's role in agriculture. Now, this is the Elliott School, and we have people coming from all over, and your focus is more global work. But I want to tell you right here and now, as much as the United States is a wonderful country, and I'm proud of all that we do and accomplish, we've got a hill to climb on women in agriculture here at this very time in this very place. There is an effort underway now at USDA led by the Deputy Secretary who followed after me, Krista Harden, and she's really trying to organize a network around women in agriculture, and I really get this. Here's my second story. So when I left USDA, we had a women's luncheon of all the political and career leaders. It was the first time we had done that, and I'd been Deputy Secretary for 4 years, 1 month. I could probably get it down to hours. It was a tough job. And I thought, why hadn't I done this before? And I'm really glad Krista has carried on that tradition. But I asked the women in the audience, I said, who is one of the first people who called me when my nomination to be Deputy Secretary became public? And who was the very first person to reach out to me after I announced I was going to resign? And they thought about it, and they thought about it. Someone said, Hillary Clinton. I said, she'd know, but that would have been nice. But there were a lot of guesses, and I finally said Ann Veneman. Now, you may not know who Ann Veneman is, but she was the Secretary of Agriculture, the first female secretary, so far the only female Secretary of Agriculture in this country. Honestly, God, I was so surprised. I thought we'd have a female President of the United States before we'd have a female Secretary of Agriculture. And Ann reached out to me, and while we come from different political parties, she was the Secretary of Agriculture during President George W. Bush's term, And while we have different views on a lot of policy issues, we were women leaders in agriculture, and it's a pretty small group. And so she reached out to me, applauding me, offering help in any way, both during my time as deputy and now in my future career endeavors. And it spoke volumes to me about how we need to do this supporting network of women. So Krista, now in her role, is carrying on a conversation about women in agriculture. And oftentimes, if you are on the Twitterverse, my 15-year-old son has figured out, I guess he blocks me from Twitter. Following him makes me a little anxious. Anyhow, I'm on Twitter. I never thought I would be. And I'm enjoying it. What's my handle? It's at Kat Merrigan, K-A-T Merrigan. Yeah, at Kat Merrigan. People really like the tweets when I goof. Like when I hit a tweet that's blank, that's what everyone favorites. So I can't say that my social media skills are the envy of anyone in the room. But the conversation at USDA has been using the hashtag Women in Ag. So that is where you can, in the Twitterverse, connect with women who are having these kind of conversations. And I think they're quite useful. So what are the realities here in the United States right now? Well, every 5 years, the U.S. Department of Agriculture does a census of agriculture. So we collect a lot of data. The last one was 2012. It takes about a year to analyze the data, aggregate it, make sense of it. So really starting 2013, late 2013-14, you start to see reports out on what the Census of Agriculture says. What we know now is that in this country we have about 1 million women farmers. That's about, well, it depends on how you count. That's the numbers are, you have to slice and dice them in a number of ways. What we know is that there are about 14% of principal farm operators in this country are female. The way our census asks the question, it's always about how you ask the question, right? They ask who's the principal farm operator, who's number 2, and who's number 3. Now, reality is there are a lot of family farms in this country, and so it's spouses and children. And so sometimes the way the census asks the question doesn't, in the end, capture the richness of the data, the kind of things that we would like to chew over. And we can do better on the census questions. But what we do know is that 14% of principal operators are women. But if you add on the number 2 person, and you put that in the data, it really goes up much more. It's 30%. And if you counted principal operators to include that second person, it would be even higher. So there's some really nice data breakdowns that have been done by Gary Madison at the Farm Credit Council that I recommend to you. Lots of pie charts and slicing and dicing the data. So if you're interested in what the status of female farmers are in the United States, that's the go-to place. We do know there's a very slight drop from the 2007 census, and we know that more young men are entering American agriculture than women. And so that surprised me because in 2007 it looked like it was going the other way around. So what does that mean, and what is that challenge that we need to confront about support structures and just making sure that agriculture is an inviting field for women? Because I would expect that at least it would be half men and half women. That would be my expectation over time. Texas has the most female farmers. But that's a big state. I lived in Texas for a while. They don't even they think of themselves as their own country. Anyone here from Texas? Yeah. Oh, okay. You know what I mean. Arizona is the state that has the highest proportion of women farmers. all shapes, all sizes, all means of production around the country, and I think that's great. And when I was at USDA going around the country, and I really went to all the different states, and I was meeting women leaders in agriculture. Most often they were very much in the local and regional food space, the organic space, really organizing very interesting entrepreneurial operations that were diverse and cutting edge. And I think it would be really great for American agriculture if we saw more and more young women coming into the fold. So your focus is the South. I did have that opportunity, as was mentioned in the kind introduction, to go to the Food Agriculture Organization of the United Nations and chair one of the ministerials that is held there. Every 2 years, the ministers of all the governments come together and they vote on FAO's budget and various policies. And I was invited to be the chair. I had worked at FAO in a couple of different stints, short-term work in Rome, Italy. Tough assignment. But I was willing to take it on. Anyhow, so it was a real thrill to go there and be the chair. But what was really interesting for me is I'm up here on the high-rise podium, and I'm looking out across the world's agricultural ministers. And it is, there were a few women there, but it was very, very sparse. And it didn't matter what country those women ministers were from. As I looked around the room, we'd lock eyes. If you go to FAO and you go into the plenary room to tour, or you're there for a meeting, there is a wall of all the different people, photographs of all the different people who have chaired the conference over the history of the organization. And there's my big head. Couldn't be prouder. Couldn't be more excited to have that opportunity. We know, and I should say the second time I went to FAO to represent our country to head up the American delegation, my one big intervention was on women in agriculture. So it seems like FAO has some work underway, could do more, but between FAO and the World Bank, they've come out with some interesting reports, and I'm sure you've seen this. Basically that if women had the same access to resources, education, education, and leadership positions, world food production would increase by 30%, which would be the equivalent of feeding 150 million people. Now, I've tried to pull back the curtain because I am an academic and some days, and really sort of get into the deep dive on that data that led to those headlines that you see in FAO and World Bank documents. But I haven't really found the underlying data. I don't know if it's a perfect number, but I have no reason to think it's wrong. And I think it really suggests a whole avenue of really important research that those of us who are at universities can undertake to undergird that data, to do site-specific, country-specific studies that sort of play that out, because I cannot think of an agricultural meeting that I've gone to in the last 5 years where there hasn't been some mantra about how are we going to feed the world? How are we going to feed the world when it's 9 to 10 billion people? And the answer is always technology. And I think technology is absolutely part of the solution. But what I don't hear often enough is empowering women as the solution to feeding the world. We know that the school feeding programs are really important that our country invests in, getting girls educated in the schools. The U.S. doesn't do enough. It's not enough what the world needs, but how do you get women to school to learn? How do you get women in leadership positions? How do you change land tenure in such a way that women are landowners and can get access to credit? The challenges globally are almost overwhelming. And yet I know that the thinking that you all do, the power in this room, could be channeled in a way to make a difference. So that is my, I told the organizers I'd take a couple of questions if there are any, but that's really the challenge here over the course of your 2 days, right? How do we change the situation? Don't get stuck in the problem statements. How do we change the situation? When I was up at Tufts University, I taught a big class, best and brightest graduate students, and they would take on a problem, an agricultural problem, whether it be about soils or water, agroforestry, and they'd turn in these great, wonderful research papers. And after my first couple of years of being a professor, I realized that almost entirely the paper was problem statement. Really well written, really well researched, coherent, elegantly produced. But it's all problem statement. So at a certain point in my academic career, I instituted a rule that at least 1/3 of the paper had to be about the solution. So as we talk over the next couple days, that's sort of a rule of thumb. We have to talk about the problems. You have to understand the problems in order to solve the problems. But don't forget to leave enough time to talk about solutions. So good morning. Thank you very much. And if there are a couple questions, I'm ready.
Could I ask one thing? Please wait for the microphone to come to you and introduce yourself very briefly.
Thank you so much. My name is Buki Williams. I'm from the Nigerian Women in Agricultural Research for Development. So I'm really excited that you talk about agricultural research because I think sometimes we focus on the production side and not remember that the agri research is important. But I am actually really curious from your experience in the United States, what the connections and the linkages has been between agricultural researchers and actual farmers. How has that relationship been built? Because I think the problem we have, I would speak for Nigeria, and I think it happens in other African countries as well, is that there's a gap. Like agricultural researchers work with farmers, but then they leave and sometimes don't come back and talk about what their research has done. Or there's a problem with extension services in getting the work to the farmers, to the end users to actually implement it. So I am curious about what you've seen in academia and working within the government in trying to bridge that gap, or if that gap actually existed.
Sure. So there are two things. There's one way that you look at that question is there are the people who are doing the ag research, and how does it get extended to the farmer? And in the United States, historically, we've had the extension service. So over time, because of various budget pressures, originally it was set up so that 1/3 of the funding for extension came from the state government, 1/3 from the local county, and 1/3 from the federal government. Over time, for a whole lot of political reasons, I could give you the 3-hour lecture on it, we have really defunded extension to the point now that we have about 15,000 extension agents nationwide. And you're thinking of 15,000, that sounds like a lot, but it's nothing compared to what it was. Sorry? Yeah, no, it's not. But here's the thing, and I've thought about this because I really believe in, making sure the farmers get this information. We are now in a world of social media, and there are a lot of ways that farmers can get information without having the extension agent come to the farm. Because I don't think there will ever be that political will and budgetary support to rebuild extension to what it once was. But how do we use cell phones, and how do we make sure there's broadband access such that farmers get access to the latest information, both in terms of production needs and markets, And how do we also make sure that farmers living in rural areas are not so isolated that life is hard? And I think particularly for young farmers, and many of the young farmers in this country who are people who are going into farming are not people who grew up on the farm. They're sort of fresh recruits, and they're not used to that potential rural isolation. And so I think building out strategies around social media is very, very important for the future of at least American agriculture. But the other way I want to look at your question is, to what extent are farmers engaged in the research enterprise? And I think that's very, very important. We haven't done it as much as we could and should. There are some programs like the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Extension Program, SARE, as some people refer to it, that has farmers engaged in the actual research. FAO does a lot with the farmer field schools, which is, the train the trainers kind of model. But to me, getting farmers engaged in the research enterprise is essential. So it's two ways I look at that question.
Thank you. Hi, thank you. My name is Chagit Ulanovsky. I'm from Israel. I'm the chairperson of the Israeli Forum for Sustainable Nutrition. And at least in Israel, it might be the same in other countries, there's a very big gap between the science and the policy. Policymakers are like 10, 15 years behind, and usually, I would say it very carefully, the farmer's interest is not their policymakers' interest. And I would like to know what you think about it and how can we solve it or at least help a little.
Policymakers are 10 or 15 years behind. Well, that's rather generous, don't you think? Yeah. I mean, I'm poking fun at myself. Most of my life I've been a policymaker more than an academic, and I've never been a farmer, which goes to my mother's pithy little retort. So right now here in this country, we have a battle underway around dietary guidelines for Americans. So every 5 years, the government produces a document that's really targeted to nutritional professionals, but then eventually there is a public-facing document that helps Americans understand what a healthy diet is. We're not alone in doing that. FAO posts 64 different countries on a website that engage in providing the public dietary guidelines. In this country, for the really the first time, the Citizen Scientific Advisory Committee recommended to the government that sustainability be a factor in deciding dietary guidance for Americans. And that has just kicked up a political storm like I could never have imagined, because at this point, I think most scientists understand that we need to grapple with sustainability, whether it's climate change or you're living in California and you're dealing with a drought. I mean, all over America, people have this recognition. And so I think this is a really prime example where the policy enterprise is sort of significantly behind in terms of where the science is and really where the American public is. So some of us are working on that issue and hope that while sustainability will not be embraced in the 2015 dietary guidelines set to come out at the end of this year, that we will have good inroads in the 2020 dietary guidelines. Now, I understand when policymakers say, oh, God, bringing in sustainability, it's wicked complex. That's hard to do. It is, because when you start doing life cycle analysis and trying to figure out all the externalities of positive and negative of food production, there are no easy answers. But because it's complex doesn't mean that we don't go there. I don't think we have a choice. We have to go there. So to your point, that that seems to be the best example these days. And by the way, all I hear about is Israel when I go around the country now because of all the stuff with drought. And I remember when I was first working in the United States Senate back in 1987, and I was dealing with the Volcani Center and some of the innovative stuff going on with drip irrigation and all that. So people are hearkening back and looking to your country for answers. So please deliver them up pretty quickly.
Mitzana, I'm from Ethiopia, but this time I'm a farmer. Well, in regarding to the research points you mentioned, that's one of the biggest challenge when you are the modern farmer, that you have problems which are not yet researched. You just want the solution fast, and then the fastest you do is you go to the Google Mama, and then you ask Google whether they have a solution for you. Yes, and then policy, I come from that before I became a farmer 10 years ago. And the real challenges I work with FAO and others is really to see a micro-based problems, how do you solve them, and get you immediately a solutions. And this requires an integration of different institutions. This is, for example, I have a problem of shea butter trees, or I have a tomato problems which has to do with global warming or insects and other issues which are beyond your scope of understanding. And it could be very good to consider there are some transborder issues where they need solutions. Maybe the research is not fast enough to give the solution, but to have an institutional place where you can discuss and to have the solution. That means for me as a farmer, I want it today because it has to do about my sustainability in 3 months. And so the question is there a way you can consider also having a policy or research activities whereby it is in a micro and a small based but interrelated?
Yeah. So there's a lot of wisdom embedded in your question, and that is a lot of the problems that we face in agriculture are very much place-based. And so it's really hard for someone sitting here to say what's right in Ethiopia and someone in the capital of Ethiopia saying what's really right in a rural place miles and miles away. And how do you do that? I don't know. I mean, in the United States, we have a 1-800 number, meaning a free dial-in number for small farmers. It's called ATTRA, A-T-T-R-A. Oh, God, in Washington, you have acronyms all the time. Appropriate Technology Transfer for Rural Areas. And it has also been a political football over the years where they've been battling over it and keep reducing the dollar amount. But it's really targeted for small farmers. It's supposed to be a lifeline when you're dealing with something and you can call someone and say, hey, I've got this tomato blight. What's the latest research? How do I get that? Also, we have a program called SANET, S-A-N-E-T, which is part of the SARE program. Also puts out, it's not a 1-800 number, but puts out a lot of information that is really very well targeted to small and mid-sized operations. But, essentially place by place, and this is a situation where I think particularly women leaders can step up. I think we need supportive networks. So it's not just about getting the latest information about that tomato mildew and what to do about it. It's about being a supportive circle of women leaders that help our colleagues through these really tough times when you're feeling very isolated and very threatened. So it's both. I wish I had a perfect answer for you. There isn't one, but it certainly is a need. And, in this country, we have had a number of farmer suicides over the last few years, and I think that people are very stressed out in the countryside. I think that the average American consumer wants to think of the big red barn and the happy farmer, and the kids are saddling up the hogs and riding around the pen. I don't know what they think, but farming is really, really hard work. If you have livestock, particularly if you have dairy, you never have a day off. It can be, you work all year and then one storm. It's just you're one storm away from complete economic ruin. And we have all the advantages that your farmers don't in your country. So I don't know the answer to your place-based question, but I wish you luck. So one last question, and then we need to go to our panel.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Rosanna Marie Neal, and I'm the director of the Sustainable World Initiative in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for your presentation. I appreciate the fact that you're bringing attention to the intersection of human health, women's empowerment, and the health of the planet. And the question that I have for you as a former policymaker and now an academic, what would you say are the most powerful ways to incentivize policymakers to take action that is in the long-term interests of people, and to incentivize people to take action that is in their long-term interests? Because people, just tend to be concerned about right here, right now, and just doing well in the moment and not really even thinking about what's best for their children in the future. Thank you.
Sure. That's an easy question to wrap up on. So, you have particular Congress people who are really driven by a vision, by a moral purpose. I would think of my own Congressman Jim McGovern from Massachusetts in that category, who is, I think, the foremost champion of people living with hunger in this country, an advocate of food stamp programs, and he's out there every day talking about that. He's driven by that. But when we just sort of look at the common denominator, and you're thinking particularly of Congress, we really need to think about the situation in the terms of a congressperson. If they're in the House, they're elected every 2 years, in the Senate every 7 years, and so it's all about building the constituent base within the district. There's no substitute for that. And even when we did the Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food initiative, and I anticipated it might be a political battle, which was one, but we put together the Compass map, which is a geospatial mapping tool where all of USDA's investments in local and regional agriculture are on the map. And what I knew is that a congressperson, before they stood up and said, local and regional food is a bad investment, they would have to look at all the dots in their district and know that they were going against those constituents. So I think an answer in a very broad way to your question, which is a very good one, is that when we think about what we would like policymakers to do, I think it needs to be accompanied by sage political strategies, not just why it's important, but why it's important to them. So thank you very much.